This week, I'm serving up a throwback episode from nearly 2 years ago, where I try to answer the question, is America heading towards a civil war? Take a listen and then let me know what you think in the comments. Civil War. Do you mean 1861 or 2022? Since the summer of 2020, increased racial tension and violent rioting left many on the internet whispering about an impending civil war. But this may not just be another conspiracy or clickbait. In fact, while we haven't seen a civil war since the 1860s, it is fairly common around the globe. Since World War II, there have been over 250 civil wars. Experts on the topic estimate that 1 in 5 nations have experienced at least 10 years of civil war. They also say that the cause for civil wars are primarily economic and not grievance-based. And the U.S. economy is far from stable right now. Someone who has seen Civil War up close says it's not looking good. Chris Hedges is a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist and former war correspondent for the New York Times. Even before the summer of racial rioting, he said, quote, "These days are the good times as compared to what's coming next." How the U.S. is living in deja vu of its antebellum days. That's coming up on Overnight Opinions. A pandemic, racial tensions, mass rioting, a crippled economy, supply chain interruptions, a Capitol protest, gas shortages, meat shortages, electric grid shutdown, a border crisis, multiple cyber attacks, a bitter election, and the potential for nuclear war. In a little over 2 years, America has managed to compile quite the highlight reel. It may not have muskets and drummer boys, but a civil war is coming. Chris Hedges has been warning that America is mirroring the ethno-political violence he witnessed when covering the Yugoslavian Civil War. Just a few years ago, he said, quote, "A society can change so quickly because the underlying structures are rotten. There is the patina or the veneer of a functioning system, but the foundations of it are so decayed that they can't take the stress. That was true in the Weimar Republic in Germany before the Nazis took full control. That was true in Yugoslavia before the Civil War and ethnic violence. It is true here in the United States, too. Our government has gone from a republic by the people and for the people to a complete kakistocracy, which is a government ruled by the least suitable or competent citizens of the state. While many will laugh it off and say it's looking like the movie Idiocracy, it's much more serious. At least in the movie, the fighting was confined to a stadium. In 2022 America, it's in the streets, suburbs, and the shopping malls. These are the 7 indicators that a civil war is approaching. Section 1. Rival economies. As the Bible says, the love of money is the root of all evil. And America is no exception to that principle. The South didn't see blacks as people, but they certainly saw them as money. Consider this excerpt from historian and Yale professor David Blight. By 1860, there was more millionaires, slaveholders all, living in the lower Mississippi Valley than anywhere else in the United States. In the same year, the nearly 4 million American slaves were worth some $3.5 billion, making them the largest single financial asset in the entire U.S. economy, worth more than all manufacturing and railroads combined. The South's economic impact was huge, and that gave them hegemonic power in the Union. But slavery was all they had. In the lead up to the war, the North was looking to flip this paradigm. They were looking to impose their ideals, specifically abolishing slavery, on the South. And by aligning with the West, the North was able to form a coalition that would diminish the South's influence on the Union. The North did this in 4 ways. First, with the Homestead Act of 1860, the North wanted to give 160 acres of land to settlers. This favored family farming, causing the South to fear it would limit large plantations and slaveholders that wanted to settle. It passed with only 1 vote from the South before being vetoed by President Buchanan. Second, after the Erie Canal opened in 1823, the North also started pitching the need for transportation improvements. The South didn't need much improvement, so these federal subsidies would go mostly to the North. By 1860, the North was lobbying for the Pacific Railway Bill, a proposal to build a transcontinental railway link to, you guessed it, the West Coast. The bill failed as no major slaveholding Southern district voted for it. Third, the South was primarily agricultural, so they needed to import a lot of goods. The North wanted to protect their goods against cheap British imports. The North pushed for higher tariffs that the South viewed as protectionist. Again, the North teamed up with the West to try and get their way in spite of Southern interests. The West needed transportation improvements, and tariffs were the federal government's main source of revenue. The West eventually acquiesced and agreed to a moderate tariff. This both protected foreign imports for the North while providing funds for federal projects in the West. Fourth, the North contained 60% of all banks, giving them a significant advantage if the federal government created a national bank, which was a hot topic at the time. The South didn't need local banking. The West wasn't keen on the idea of a national bank either, believing all the Eastern banks would exert too much influence. However, they desperately needed local banking to finance new crops and sided with the North. The National Banking System Bill in 1860 ultimately failed when Southern states refused to back it. The North didn't always get their way, but they were still nipping at the South's heels, always finding ways to marginalize them, threatening their economy and way of life. As James Huston in the Journal of Southern History stated, quote, Northerners recognized that by means of a national market, the effects of the Southern labor system could be transmitted to the North, depress the wages of its free laborers, and thereby upset its economy. Northerners therefore felt compelled to constrict the effects of slavery. By the same token, Southerners who had placed vast amounts of wealth in slaves opposed any restrictions upon their property rights. But how does this play out today? Well, in this post-pandemic world, we're seeing a similar economic standoff. It's called essential versus non-essential. In the beginning of the Great Lockdown, states began defining the contours of the new economy. Big chain stores and franchises won out. Walmart, Target, and Amazon were all allowed to keep their jobs and businesses running, but local restaurants, mom-and-pop stores, or boutiques were not. You see, one day the government decided they just weren't essential. After the pandemic began, the world's over 2,000 billionaires saw their collective wealth rise by $4 trillion, an increase of 54%. But a lot of Americans didn't do so well. 58 to 68% of the leisure, hospitality, food services, construction, and retail industries saw layoffs or a reduction of hours. The accommodations and food services industry was still down over 15%, even a year after the initial lockdown. But the dividing line of the pandemic isn't just between the billionaires and everyone else. It also pits professional workers versus trade workers. Nearly half of the U.S. workforce began working from home full-time during the pandemic, but this favors those in generally white-collar office roles who only need a phone and a computer. These workers not only got to keep their job, they got to save money. The average remote worker saves around $4,000 a year, saving on commute, wardrobe, and lunches. This doesn't even begin to cover savings and childcare. Pre-Civil War, the North tried to put the economic squeeze on the South to achieve its ideals of ending slavery. Now the government is pitting half the country against the other half, squeezing one economically to achieve their lockdown goals. It's simple. Just comply with everything that they say or the lockdown will never end. The instances may be separated by 160 years, but the tactics are the same. The government has and will continue to use economic warfare aimed at its own citizens to achieve its goals. Historian Richard Brown has noted that, quote, without attempting to prove that modernization caused a civil war, one may argue that it was very much the conflict of a modernizing society. In 1860, two different economies were trying to blend together. Today, one economy is fracturing into two economies. The North was upgrading society for noble intentions, ending slavery. Today, the government is creating a new normal that is less than noble, preparing us for the Great Reset. We can see that today as the trucker convoy descends on Washington, D.C. The elite class is mandating rules on vaccines for blue-collar workers. This tends to appease professionals in office jobs who believe they know better than those who aren't college educated or who work in labor jobs. However, it's still a dividing line that benefits one side of society while placing an onus on the other. One believes that their health is dependent on someone else's compliance, and the other feels their right to bodily autonomy shall not be infringed. As friction between the North and the South brewed during the 1860s, talks of secession began to take hold. We can see that today as the trucker convoy descends on Washington, D.C. The elite class is mandating rules on vaccines for blue-collar workers. This tends to appease professionals in office jobs who believe they know better than those who aren't college educated or people who work in labor jobs. However, it's still a dividing line that benefits one side of society while placing an onus on the other. One believes their health is dependent on someone else's compliance, and the other feels their right to bodily autonomy shall not be infringed. This concludes Part 1, Is America Heading Towards a Civil War? This is Part 2, On the Brink of Secession. The South was rife with the sentiment of leaving the Union for nearly 4 decades. The cultural and economic gaps were too big to ignore. The North was industrial, the South was agricultural. One used free labor, and the other used slave labor. These differences, and the North's attempts at deprecating the South, enabled talk about the importance of states' rights. In fact, the Civil War wasn't the South's first attempt at secession. Enter the nullification crisis of 1832. South Carolina had been particularly peeved at increased federal tariffs in 1828. John Calhoun was an ardent supporter of the constitutional theory of nullification. This theory, stemming from Thomas Jefferson's concept of states' rights, espoused the idea that the Constitution was administered by the states. This meant a state or group of people could nullify a federal law if it violated their interests. Basically, states didn't serve the federal government served the states. Another tariff arrived in 1832. John C. Calhoun was a prominent spokesman of slave states at the time and rallied behind this theory. He said in a letter that the tariff was, quote, of vastly inferior importance to the great question to which it has given rise, the right of a state to interpose, in the last resort, in order to arrest an unconstitutional act of the general government. On November 24, 1832, South Carolina adopted the Ordinance of Nullification. President Andrew Jackson claimed that states were subordinate to the federal government and said that, quote, disunion by armed force is treason. Congress then threatened to use the military to collect tariffs. South Carolina backed down. However, this only underscored to the South that they were the minority and subject to the whims of the North. For now, a crisis was abated. Nearly 30 years later, on December 20th, 1860, South Carolina became the first state to secede. Within 6 months, 11 states would join South Carolina. President Lincoln wasn't even halfway through his first year in office. The country was divided and a bloody civil war had just begun. The Northern abolition movement hit at the crux of the changing labor system and social structure. So where does this leave us for today? Well, secession is the obvious final straw before a civil war, and if we don't watch out, another one may be coming. No state has formally seceded yet, but we are seeing the early warning signs. Just like the nullification crisis in 1832, states are refusing to comply with the federal government. One would think an issue like slavery would be easy to determine right from wrong. Likewise, one would think there would be a right and wrong way to handle a pandemic. But 2020 showed us that we are divided on more than just politics. We are divided on our worldview. While the country collectively watched the news slack-jawed in March 2020, we found out relatively quickly just how disaffected states were in the federal government. 7 states never imposed restrictions, opting for autonomy and completely bucking the so-called health experts in the federal government. Florida decided to reopen in September 2020. Texas did so the following March, both at the behest of newly elected President Biden, the CDC, and the NIH. And the further we got into 2021, a myriad of other states slowly began lifting restrictions. States were also rejecting the federal government's funding. Before long, more and more states began ending the $300 supplemental employment benefits, seeing this bonus money as a barrier to people getting off unemployment and getting back to work. Beyond lockdowns, arguments over vaccination and masking policies began to take root as well. The country became divided over mask mandates, especially for children, and even more people began to clash over vaccine mandates for workers, either public or private. Attorney generals began suing the federal government to have these repealed, and even the Supreme Court ended up striking down Biden's vaccine mandate for private employers with more than 100 people, angering the left and rallying the right. While armies are not trading bullets, fighting words are definitely being hurled towards the federal government. In February of 2021, it was rumored that the White House was considering imposing domestic travel restrictions, specifically on Florida. Governor DeSantis wasn't having it, telling reporters, quote, I think it would be unconstitutional, it would be unwise, and it would be unjust. He went on to say, any attempt to restrict or lock down Florida by the federal government would be an attack on our state done purely for political purposes. States are also fracturing over a question of civil liberties. While the White House has said they are not mandating one, vaccine passports have become a political football. So far, 27 states have banned or are considering banning vaccine passports. 2 states, New York and Oregon, have implemented vaccine passports, and we are all waiting to see what the remaining 21 states will do. The North and South failed to reconcile their different lifestyles and economies. They were growing apart in a time that technology was bringing them together. If the two sides could have remained isolated, maybe the Union wouldn't have erupted into war, or at least not so soon. As James L. Huston notes, quote, as long as the United States was fragmented into small market areas, these two regimes did not conflict, but the transportation revolution stitched market areas together, and no longer could the effects of slavery be confined to the South. Even President Lincoln, the famous abolitionist, wasn't wanting war. As the North and South's worlds began colliding in a changing economy, neither could accept the other. Lincoln was trying to keep the country together as it was falling apart. In a letter to the New York Tribune, he said, quote, if I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing all the slaves, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing some and leaving others alone, I would also do that. What I do about slavery and the colored race, I do because I believe it helped save the Union. And what I forbear because I do not believe it would help to save the Union. Just like today, our partisan and cultural divide has been bubbling for some time, but lockdowns and vaccines are bringing them to the point of not just disagreement, but incompatibility. You're either vaccinated or unvaccinated, much like you're either an abolitionist or a slaveholder. These are not as much political affiliations as much as personal identities. When you couldn't go anywhere, it didn't matter if you were vaccinated. But as the U.S. starts trying to get back to normal, everyone's opinion on someone else's health status is first and foremost on everyone's mind. Right now, the upper class is pointing their finger at the lower class, demanding that they get vaccinated. But this very class of people are the ones that keep society moving, blue-collar workers, specifically truckers. While office workers and government agencies and bureaucrats and politicians may think they can control others, society can't work if the ones who prop it up stop working. We saw what happened in Canada. Now we have our own trucker convoy. Unfortunately for pro-vaxxers, they depend on the so-called anti-vaxxers for the very food on their tables. For now, we have a traffic jam on the Beltway, but if it persists, food shortages and more supply chain issues will spread across the U.S. And when people get hungry and angry, bad things happen. Everyone has a different idea of what a safe or healthy person is now, with some seeing someone who is unvaccinated as okay, and others seeing them as a potential typhoid Mary. In our antebellum days, slavery was the elephant in the room that made it hard for the North and South to mix. Now the elephant is one's vaccine status. And we've all heard buzz online and on TV about shunning those who are unvaccinated. The elephant is here. We're just waiting for it to stampede. This concludes Part 2, Is America Heading Towards a Civil War? This is Section 3, the Dred Scott Decision. In the run-up to the Civil War, the Supreme Court issued one of its most infamous opinions. The case involved a slave named Dred Scott. He sued for his freedom, and after circulating through multiple courts, it made its way to the highest court in the land. In 1857, the Supreme Court ruled that since Scott wasn't a citizen because he was black, he thus had no right to sue. That same decision stated that the Missouri Compromise of 1820, a piece of legislation that managed to restrict slavery in certain states, was unconstitutional. The decision wasn't well received by the North, nor was it viewed as an honest interpretation of the Constitution. 7 of the justices were appointed by pro-slavery presidents from the South, including 5 who were from slaveholding families. The only 2 dissenting justices were Republicans. Today, we see the same disillusion about the Supreme Court. The fight over placing a justice on the court is almost entirely political. No party wants the other to seat a justice. We saw this with President Obama during his last year in office and his failure to get Merrick Garland on the bench due to a Republican majority in the Senate. We saw this fight bubble up again for each of President Trump's 3 picks. And the rage of Amy Coney Barrett solidifying a conservative majority sent Democrats into shrill whining, proclaiming that President Trump appointing her just before the election was somehow unfair. Democrats immediately began touting the idea of court packing, adding more justices so they could realign the bench to a more liberal way. Candidate Joe Biden danced around the issue, refusing to give an answer. Yet, when he became president, he made quite the step towards reimagining the court. He started the Presidential Commission on the Supreme Court of the United States, and it would, as you guess, provide analysis on, quote, the length of service and turnover of justices on the court, the membership and size of the court. We're playing political games with a branch that is supposed to be neutral. Just like Amy Coney Barrett, packing the court will leave Republicans incensed. As we devalue the bench, we set ourselves up for a 21st century Dred Scott ruling. What it will be and when, who knows, but we can all rest assured a controversial ruling will not bode well for our republic. Section 4. Birth of a New Party. Northerners were outraged and energized. Republicans in the North saw the Scott decision as a slave power conspiracy between the executive and judicial branches. The Republican Party had formed only a few years prior. They were disaffected members of the Whig Party, looking to take a more serious anti-slavery platform. This new party really came alive after the Dred Scott decision. Republicans referred to pro-slavery Southerners as fire eaters and began to discuss whether they would abide by the court's decision. The party was energized, angry, and filled with righteous indignation. The Dred Scott ruling would help them channel this into establishing a major party. By the next election, their anger would propel a charismatic leader for the cause into president, and then finally lead them into a civil war. When Lincoln ran against Douglas for the U.S. Senate in 1858, the issue of slavery consumed the debates. These were so defining that they were printed and passed out. They dominated the presidential election of 1860, laying bare the differences that existed in the Union at that time. We can see some similarities between Lincoln's ascension and Trump. He rode the America First wave all the way to the White House, pushing the idea of Americanism over globalism. He championed individualism at a time when we had just seen 2 terms of collectivist ideas in President Obama. In 2015, Donald Trump descended into the political scene on an escalator, and he's been dominating politics ever since. Just like abolitionists found their leader in Lincoln, the forgotten working-class American people found a hero in Trump. The Republican Party quickly rebranded and became the Trump Party. The disdain for government power from the 2016 Trump voter has morphed into a pushback of the prevailing pandemic narrative. Rising Trump copycats are following suit and championing choice when it comes to vaccines. The left is pushing back, advocating vaccine passports and restrictions. As the new Trump Republican Party remains energized, how long before it runs headfirst into the left and President Biden? Decades of quarreling of slavery had pitted the North and South against each other. They tried several compromises to limit slavery, but no one was satisfied. The Republican Party split over the issue, demanding that abolition become their new doctrine. Then the 1860 election arrived, and anti-slavery New Republican Party candidate Abraham Lincoln won. That sure didn't help ease tensions in the Union. The issue of slavery was hot, but the election itself became the final tear that ripped the nation in two. Much like the 2020 election, half the country didn't recognize it as legitimate. And so begins a story we are all too familiar with. This concludes Part 3 and 4 of Is America Heading Towards a Civil War? This is Part 5, A Turbulent Election. The Supreme Court just voided the Missouri Compromise in their Dred Scott decision a few years earlier. No longer was the West deemed a free territory. The divide over slavery and abolitionists just got deeper. Lincoln would lose his Senate bid a year later, but it would transcend him into the leader of the Republican Party and the new voice for the abolitionist movement. The next presidential election was sure to be a barn burner. The Republicans had their man in Lincoln, but the Democrats were split. In fact, the slave-loving South split and 2 parties emerged, Southern Democrats and the Constitutional Party. This divided the vote, all but ensuring that Republican nominee Lincoln would win. And that's exactly what happened. Lincoln won with almost no support in the South. He wasn't even on the ballot in 9 southern states. Lincoln swept the North, allowing him to win 18 of the total 33 states, winning 180 of the 303 electoral votes. In fact, when the popular vote was tallied, fewer than 4 in 10 Americans actually voted for Lincoln. Needless to say, the South was ticked. They had essentially pooped in their own dinner plate. Now, this new leader of the abolitionist movement was going to be in charge. 6 weeks later, South Carolina's leaders met and decided to secede from the Union. By January 5th, more states joined. In March, Lincoln assumed office. By April, a dispute between the newly formed and seceding Confederacy over Fort Sumter led to blows with the North. Forced to choose, 4 more southern states joined the secession. After serving less than 2 months in office, newly elected President Lincoln found himself in the middle of a civil war. Abraham Lincoln once said, "A house divided against itself cannot stand." He went on further, saying, quote, "This government cannot endure permanently half slave and half free." Those words have never been truer than they are today. America is divided, and this nation certainly can't endure with half believing the election was stolen and half believing it wasn't. Much like in the late 1850s, we spent a large part of President Trump's term arguing the mere legitimacy of the Supreme Court. Trump got to pick 3 Supreme Court justices, ultimately tipping the court towards a 6-3 conservative bend. The appointment of Amy Coney Barrett just weeks before the 2020 election spurred many Democrats to propose the idea of court packing. During the election, Biden famously refused to answer a question about court packing. Much like Dred Scott did to the Union in 1857, America now found herself not even thinking the highest court, a neutral branch, could be nonpartisan. Remember how the South seceded within 6 weeks of the election? Well, Trump supporters began taking to D.C., protesting the election was stolen, leading to the riot at the Capitol on January 6th. We also saw formidable legal pushback almost immediately. Half the country even filed a lawsuit contesting the election to the Supreme Court. At this point, the Supreme Court wasn't only delegitimized, but now half the country came to doubt our own electoral system. Now, as Biden is picking his own Supreme Court justice, the right is unhappy. Everything is partisan, even judicial decisions. The left didn't trust the high court under Trump, and the right doesn't trust the high court under Biden. No one trusts elections. The right didn't trust them in 2020, and now the left is ginning up voter suppression claims, questioning legitimacy to push the passage of the John Lewis Voting Act. We are surely in for some turbulent times. We're really just waiting for our very own Fort Sumter to kick off the Civil War. Will the People's Convoy be that Fort Sumter? Thousands of trucks are beginning to jam the Capitol Beltway. Gas prices are going through the roof. We're on the verge of nuclear war. Supply chain is already crippled. Fertilizer shortages are disrupting food production. Home and car prices are skyrocketing. With all that's going on, the very people that keep America's supply chain humming are striking. How will Biden respond? Will he be a Trudeau and be a tyrant? What will happen when the shelves go empty and truckers are still parked on the Beltway? Those that support vaccine mandates will surely grow restless. If we don't have our Fort Sumter in the People's Convoy, will it be the Ukrainian crisis? Will people finally split over the fact of going to yet another war and sending our children to die to preserve another country? Who knows what and when Fort Sumter will come, but one thing's for certain, it's on its way. The Civil War was like a divorce. It wasn't just one thing that caused the separation. A million little grievances piled up, each compounding on top of the other until a succession seemed like the only solution. Then the final blow, the required filing for divorce. For the antebellum South, that moment came with the election of Abraham Lincoln. The Dred Scott decision helped propel him to being the Republican Party's nominee. In 1860 and 2020, the presidential election became a time in which we all definitively sided with one group or the other. There are no milquetoast feelings about Biden or Trump. Love or hate them, there is no in between. While no bullets have been traded yet, we are fighting with each other all the time over masks, over vaccines, over the insurrection, over critical race theory, over transgender rights, over what pronouns people use. It never ends. Much like the South, Trump supporters are gathering and gearing up. Trump has been hosting fundraisers and entertaining GOP leaders, and now he is out holding MAGA rallies in battleground states. He pops up every so often to tease a 2024 run. But what will we have to look forward to? Will it be a civil war? This concludes Part 5, Is America Heading Towards a Civil War? Part 6, The Economic, Social, and Cultural Differences of the North and South. Slaves were a massive part of the Southern economy. In fact, in the 11 Confederate states, slaves represented 38% of the population, making up 23% of whites' income. As James L. Huston notes in the Journal of Southern History, quote, Southerners were not going to allow any attack upon the property rights that gave them wealth and income. Northerners could not allow Southerners to win the battle over property rights because it would cause a fundamental recasting of Northern society. When something makes up nearly a quarter of your income, it is not just pocket change, it is your lifestyle, it's your culture, it's the fabric of your society. Gerald Gunderson points out in the Journal of Economic History that the Civil War didn't make much economic sense. For example, the Civil War cost about $3.7 billion. The cost of compensated emancipation, or buying all of the slaves' freedom, would have been about $2.5 billion. As he points out, quote, both Northerners and Southerners believed that their societies were endangered, and those perceptions reached paranoid proportions by the 1850s. The existence of two systems of property, both of which produced income from massive amounts of investment, and one of which intruded with damaging effects upon the other, is sufficient to generate massive conflict. One additional aspect of human behavior, however, must be invoked in order to obtain the final result, civil war. In order to preserve accumulated property or even to extend the bounds of property ownership, some people will kill other people. Becoming an endangered society is surely a motivating factor that would encourage people to kill their neighbors. But before they began killing each other, they began hating each other, calling each other disparaging names. Take, for example, the aftermath of the Dred Scott decision. It ruled that either free or enslaved African Americans were not U.S. citizens. Republicans were miffed. The majority opinion was decided by 7 Democrat justices. The only dissenting justices were the other 2 Republicans on the court. As a result, Northerners began saying that the court was dominated by Southern fire eaters. Things went beyond political cartoons and prodding. During the 1850s, Northerners and Southerners began clashing over slavery out west. Northerners who headed to Kansas and wanted to prevent slavery from expanding were called Free Staters. Meanwhile, pro-slavery raiders who went into Kansas were referred to as border ruffians. This us versus them mentality was pervasive. This continued even after the Civil War. During the Reconstruction era, they called each other carpetbaggers and scalawags. Now let's jump forward to today. We have pro-masker and anti-vaxxer, pro-vaxxers and anti-vaxxers. We have those who follow the science and those who are science deniers. But this name-calling as a defense started a bit before the pandemic-era craziness. The right called the left libtards and snowflakes. The left called the right teabaggers and deplorables. The pandemic only brought this hatred out even more, because now we were talking about issues that affect your everyday life. You might say, but hey, what about abortion? We call each other pro-life or pro-choice, and no civil war ever happened after Roe v. Wade. True, but that largely fell along religious and philosophical lines. Abortion rights only affect you if you need an abortion. However, everyone needs a job, and mask and vaccine mandates complicate matters. It can be the difference between being employed or being unemployed. It affects your bottom dollar and involves forcing one to do something they may not want to do or may have a different opinion on. And let's face it, abortion affects women's lives way more than men's. A man may be for or against abortion, but they will never need the procedure. But mask and vaccine mandates affect men, not just women. And let's go back to the words. Pro-life and pro-choice aren't necessarily demeaning. It identifies which side of the aisle or side of that issue you're on. But in and of itself, being called pro-life isn't as insulting as being called a libtard or a deplorable. It just is what it is. The disdain that existed for each other was so strong for each leading up to the Civil War that it only took a couple of words to describe, like a fire eater. There was no nuance. Today we find ourselves in the same situation, but let's add another layer on top of this division. If you think having friends and family with different opinions on wearing masks is tricky, try having one that owns a slave or is fighting for the right to own one. During the Civil War, it pitted families against each other. They weren't just on opposite sides of the aisle, they were on opposite sides of the firing line. Even Abraham Lincoln had family members who fought in the Confederate Army. As the book The Divided Family in Civil War America said, quote, "The idea that two brothers or a father and son or a husband and wife could assume opposing stances in the war has both captivated and perplexed scholars, writers of fiction, and filmmakers since the first shots were fired over Fort Sumter." The families that are most likely to be caught in the Great Division lived in the border states of Missouri, Kentucky, Tennessee, Virginia, Maryland, Delaware, and Washington, D.C. The book references an 1861 letter in which a woman writes, quote, "There is scarcely a family that is not divided." Another reference comes from a newspaper of the day that said, quote, "Secession has broken up the dear social relations in every community of the border slave states, turning son against father, brother against brother, daughter against mother, friend against friend." But one of the most jarring examples from the book comes from October 1862 in Perryville, Kentucky. Just 20 feet away from each other, one man shot and killed another soldier. This enemy soldier was his brother. The Louisville Daily Journal reported that he told his brother that, quote, he had done it on purpose. He gave him water and a blanket and then left. He eventually came back and stayed with his dying brother for part of the night. The newspaper then went on to explain away what happened, saying that Hopkins was, quote, a man of family. The book, The Divided Family in Civil War America, sums up this paradox, saying, quote, "The public rules of combat forced these two men to suppress their kinship ties and become enemies." Now, fast forward to today. The division runs through more than just border lines. It runs through the family line. Of course, no one is shooting their brother over mandates yet, but we are finding families fraught with vaccine and mask disagreements. Think of all the families who require proof of vaccine or COVID testing to come to holiday gatherings. Brides are even asking for proof of vaccination for their weddings. It's become vitriol on both sides. Pointing your finger at your family and friends, calling them a name, and then running off to get away isn't mature. It's only making things more tense. Sure, people argued at Thanksgiving with their goofy relatives about politics, but at least they all felt like they could still be in the same room. Now people won't even associate with them. Watch the news or go online. There are countless articles written on how to talk to those that are vaccine hesitant. Really? We're so far apart, we need mainstream news to tell us how to converse with our own family. No one has picked up a rifle against a family member, but they have locked the door against them. The mass ignorance to get along despite our differences has forced this country into isolation. Part 7. Lincoln was a tyrant, but we still have some today. Lincoln is portrayed as a hero. He won the Civil War and ended slavery, a tremendous feat based on equality for all. But he was also a tyrant. Yes, that may not be politically correct to say, but he was. He was ruthless against Southerners. And remember, these aren't foreign enemies. These were our own citizens, our fellow countrymen. On April 24, 1863, President Lincoln issued the General Order, which was also known as the Lieber Code. At that time, Union generals were facing questions on the rules of war that they couldn't resolve. Thus, the Lieber Code was drafted. It contained 157 provisions, outlining rules and general principles of what soldiers could and couldn't do. Prior to this, we had the codes of Gratius and de Vittel. But these old ones forbid assaults on armies upon non-combatants. The Lieber Code was sought to change this and allowed the Army to do almost anything it wanted under the provision that it was military necessity. And this necessity always superseded legality and humanity. Article 17 okayed starving people. It said, quote, "War is not carried on by arms alone. It is lawful to starve the hostile belligerent, armed or unarmed, so that it leads to the speedier subjection of the enemy." Union General William Sherman carried out crushing defeats against the South. However, he was greatly troubled by the actions that he saw, saying, quote, "The amount of burning, stealing, and plundering done by our army makes me ashamed of it. I would rather quit the service if I could, because I fear that we are drifting to the worst sort of vandalism. You and I and every commander must go through the war, justly charged with crimes at which we blush." When a Southerner called Sherman out and labeled him a barbarian for leading his army to do such things, Sherman replied by saying, "May take your house, your fields, your everything, and turn you out helpless to starve. It may be wrong, but that don't alter the case." Union soldier Joshua Chamberlain also criticized the violent means at which the Union was resorting to, saying, quote, "I'm willing to fight men in arms, but not babes in arms." Union General Don Carlos Buell resigned in protest of what he saw, saying, quote, "I believe that the policy and means with which the war was being prosecuted were discreditable to the nation and a stain on civilization." Not only was there plundering and vandalism and burning and starving, but women were raped, imprisoned, mistreated, and then sent north without any assistance. America committed gross atrocities during the Civil War, all at the hands of a tyrant, Abraham Lincoln. Now, fast forward to the pandemic era of America today. President Joe Biden levied a thinly veiled threat last year. Uncle Joe tweeted, quote, "The rule is not simple. Get vaccinated or wear a mask until you do. The choice is yours." Now, it didn't take long for Republican congressmen to clap back. Representative Paul Gosar wrote, quote, "Men must be governed by God or they will be ruled by tyrants." Normally, there's not much value in a tweet, but Gosar isn't too far off about tyrants. In President Biden's first day in office, he signed more executive orders than Trump, Obama, and Bush combined. So far, he has signed a total of 87. Through the stroke of his pen and federal agencies, he has issued sweeping vaccine mandates for truckers, healthcare workers, and federal employees, not to mention private businesses. Some have been curtailed by the Supreme Court, others have not. Nevertheless, we're setting a dangerous stage in the White House, one that makes the president more like a king, issuing and ordering decrees at his whim. It's what he wants when he wants it, and Biden isn't the only one to blame. During Trump's tenure, he issued more than 200 executive orders. Obama issued more than 275, Bush had nearly 300, and Clinton just over 250. Something is happening in this country where as long as your guy's in office, we don't really care if tyranny is creeping in. It's almost like we yearn for a benevolent master. Obama, Trump, and Biden all complained about excessive executive orders, yet they did the opposite when they got in office. Biden even went so far as to say there are things, quote, "you can't do by executive order unless you're a dictator. We're a democracy. We need a consensus." And Biden was right. Yet here we are 87 executive orders later. They likely didn't matter much before. Perhaps you never paid attention to the number of executive orders or their content. Let's face it, who wants to read legal documents and policy directives? But administration after administration did it, and now we're left in a situation where a president thinks he can executive order his way into the arms of every American. Remember last fall when he said, quote, "We've been patient, but our patience is wearing thin"? Interesting choice of words. Seems like you're only worthy of patience if you eventually comply with him. During the election, he said he would not mandate vaccines, but seems like he didn't really mean that. This isn't commentary on whether you should get the vaccine. It's your body and your choice. You know what is best for you. What I am saying is that forcing people to do something that is so invasive as injecting someone is startling. What if he got up there and forced Americans to pray, forced them to take communion, or forced them to go to church? We would all scream about the constitutional injustice. Same here. We have religious liberty, and overriding this because you really want to in one area is dangerous. We also have a right to privacy. These mandates are a slippery slope to tyranny. And when tyrants rise, people rise up too. We're merely ricocheting tyranny from one administration to the other. If we get a president of a different party in 2024, we're likely to see an extreme swing in the other direction, and that's not good. The more used we get to having a tyrant, the more likely we are to not only have a civil war, but also unleash senseless brutality against our fellow man, just like Lincoln. Extreme leaders will only more clearly define the contours of the division that exists within our country. Maybe you think this pandemic is serious enough to make an exception for vaccines. Okay, but who decides what is serious enough? What happens if Republicans take back Congress this fall? What if they win the White House in 2024? What type of mandates will they issue with the precedent that exceptions are okay if they are important or serious enough? Just think of what would happen if someone like Ted Cruz became president. It makes us all want to pull our hair out. Can you imagine the tyranny that someone like him would bring to this country? Having a government or a president that thinks they know best on all things and decide everything about your life is the exact opposite of what this country represents. This type of oppressing government rule won't keep you safe. It is the definition of tyranny. We shouldn't want our predilections or lifestyle forced on anyone because eventually our guy will be gone and our enemy will take his place. And no one wants their enemy controlling their life. My conclusion for the deep cut on Are We About to Enter a Civil War? Well, the inability to believe in the same principles is what sent the Union into disarray 160 years ago. Today, it's not North versus South, it's left versus right. When reflecting on the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln said, quote, "Both parties deprecated war, but one of them would make war rather than let the nation survive, and the other would accept war rather than let it perish, and the war came. Try and tell me that doesn't sound like the times we're living in now." 2% of the U.S. population was killed during the Civil War. 1 in 5 Southern white men of military age were killed. More people died in the Civil War than all wars combined up until the Vietnam War. We did this to our fellow countrymen with just muskets, cannons, and bayonets. Now we have much bigger and badder toys. We have drones that can be weaponized, flamethrowers, grenades, and guns. So many guns. In fact, there are more guns in this country than there are people. So one thing is for sure, when the next Civil War happens, it's going to be a lot bloodier. Thanks for listening to this extended series, Is America Heading Towards a Civil War? Be sure to tune in next week for an all-new episode. In the meantime, be sure to follow Ladies Love Politics on TikTok, YouTube, and Instagram.